Hello everyone, it's Charlie in Westeros here, and today I'm going to explore and discuss a very significant event and question in the universe of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. That is, what transpired at the infamous Tower of Joy, where Lyanna Stark famously told her brother, quote, "Promise me, Ned," and what is its significance? Major questions that are, as of yet, not fully answered in George R.R. Martin's work. Breakdown for this video will be as follows. I will first give an overview of the location itself and what is factually known of the event before presenting the most popular, and a few less popular, theories surrounding the Tower of Joy, and end with my own personal opinion on what might have gone down at this location. So to start things off, we have to look at some of the background information. The Tower of Joy was a round tower located in the northern edge of the Red Mountains of Dorne, along the Prince's Pass, with Kingsgrave in Dorne to the south, and Night Song in the Stormlands to the north. This effectively puts the Tower of Joy pretty much near the intersection point of Dorne, the Stormlands, and the Reach. The Tower of Joy itself was given its name by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, implying this location had a happy or pleasant significance for the Targaryen prince, and this is certainly a noteworthy thing considering Rhaegar Targaryen reportedly spent much of the war against Robert Baratheon at the tower itself with Lyanna Stark, and only left once King Aerys sent Gerald Hightower to find him, leaving Gerald and two other knights of the Kingsguard, Oswell Went, and the prince's closest friend in Arthur Dayne, to guard Lyanna. Of course, as we know, the Targaryens lost the war, with Rhaegar dying at the Battle of the Trident, whispering Lyanna's name as he perished, based on Daenerys' vision at the House of the Undying. After Eddard Stark left King's Landing and lifted the siege of Storm's End by the Tyrells, he rode to the Tower of Joy with 6 companions, including Howland Reed. Surprisingly or not, the 3 Kingsguard opted to fight Ned Stark and his companions. In one of Ned's dreams, he hears Lyanna screaming while he clashes with the Kingsguard, triggering a vision of blue rose petals blowing across a blood-streaked sky. Whether or not this detail is true, only Ned and Howland Reed survive the fight with the 3 Kingsguard members, and upon entering the tower, Ned finds Lyanna inside, lying in a bed of blood. Supposedly, Lyanna died in a room that, quote, smelled of blood and roses, and was suffering from a fever that had taken her strength. Her voice was faint, and there was fear in her eyes. Her final words were, "Promise me, Ned." When her brother gave his word, the fear left her. She smiled, and her fingers clutched his own in a tight grip. They were still holding each other as she gave up her hold on life. Rose petals slipped from her palm, dead and black. Later, Howland Reed and seemingly at least one other individual found Eddard still holding her corpse. Howland managed to separate the hands of the living man and the dying girl, although Eddard apparently had no recollection of what happened after Lyanna died. In sum, what we know from this event include a feeble young Lyanna dying in a pool of blood, a demand of a promise from her to Ned, an emphasis on seemingly blue rose petals, and at least one remaining living witness out there in the form of Howland Reed. So what assumptions can we make of these facts? Well, certainly a number of these aforementioned images have led to a wide range of theories, most emphasizing the notion that Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark are the birth parents of Jon Snow. Of course, more recently, a number of other theories have also arisen to explain what the Tower of Joy, quote, truly means, and I will certainly address those, but let's first discuss the most popular R+L=J aspect of this event. In the second book, when Dany was in the House of the Undying in Qarth, she had a vision of a sweet-scented blue flower growing from a chink in a wall of ice. This image is often believed to indicate Jon Snow's true parentage given Lyanna's association with the imagery of blue winter roses and Jon's service to the Night's Watch at the Wall. Lyanna's apparent death in a pool of blood is typically viewed as her dying whilst giving birth to Jon, and the promise she asks Ned is usually seen as something along the lines of, "Promise to keep my son safe," or "Promise to raise him," etc., especially considering the recent demise of the other Targaryens in Westeros. Evidently, this theory has been accompanied by a wide range of criticisms, so for the sake of this video, Let's look at them and attempt to respond from a pro R plus L equals J standpoint, before having a look at some of the other theories. The first of these criticisms include the notion that if Jon is the prince that was promised, and is to be a legitimate Targaryen heir to the throne, Rhaegar and Lyanna would have had to marry because he is still a bastard, if they didn't, and therefore his claim or significance is reduced, if altogether irrelevant. I would say this is true in part, but there is more to it than that. Now, one could say that the earlier Targaryens practiced polygamy, and so an argument in favor of a legitimate Jon Targaryen could be made if Rhaegar had opted to actually marry Lyanna and make her a second wife, sort of mirroring Aegon the Conqueror and his 2 wives. But I think there is an alternative explanation, and that is, in short, why should it matter whether or not Jon is or isn't a bastard? I mean this in 2 senses. For one, it looks as though the fate of House Baratheon, assuming the books follow the TV show outcome, is now in the hands of a very prominent bastard in the form of Gendry, along with Edric Storm in the books, meaning that being a legitimate child of a prince or a king could very well become irrelevant at the end of the story if one expects Jon to inherit the Iron Throne. Certainly this isn't too much of an issue in Dorne, and it would appear that Westeros is certainly on the brink of absolute social upheaval, which could very well alter many entrenched social norms in the kingdom. But even if Jon isn't destined for the Iron Throne, one could look to the explanation that he could very well be the godlike prince that was promised, or Azor Ahai reborn, and that is certainly a position far greater than a ruler who would sit the Iron Throne, and wouldn't it be something if a bastard were to hold so much significance that in spite of his humble birth, Jon is destined for indescribable greatness, and it's certainly not something I would put past George R. R. Martin, but that is entering endgame territory, and is therefore a topic for a separate video. Another prominent criticism is, if R plus L equals J is true, and the Kingsguard was protecting Lyanna, then why would they choose to fight Ned and his companions, considering it's his sister? Well, the 3 members of the Kingsguard Ned encounters are evidently quite poised in their mission and vows to Prince Rhaegar, and in this they appear to stand quite differently from some of the other members of the Kingsguard. Arthur Dayne in particular was Rhaegar's closest friend, so it isn't entirely unreasonable to expect him to fulfill his duty to his prince, even in death. Moreover, they had no way of knowing that Ned wouldn't harm Lyanna's child. Their loyalty was to their prince and king, and if this child being born comes first and foremost, especially if he was of some significance, then they wouldn't take any chances at risking his potential safety. Certainly this explanation isn't the most foolproof, but if these men were stubborn enough to value specific aspects of their duty as Kingsguards, then this gesture might not be entirely uncalled for. Anyway, this brings me to another criticism. Why would the Kingsguard protect this mistress and third potential child of Rhaegar's, who could very well be illegitimate, and not be instructed to protect Rhaegar's true-born heirs? Well, this merits a few answers. For one, Rhaegar's true-born heirs would have been in apparent safety at King's Landing, given that the city was not yet threatened, and Tywin's treachery had not yet come to pass, when the 3 were ordered to remain at the Tower of Joy. Keep in mind, Elia and her children have an entire city guard and a great keep to protect them, so the assistance of 3 admittedly great knights weren't necessarily the be-all end-all in protecting Rhaegar's children by Elia. That said, and if I can inject a hypothesis of my own, if Rhaegar loved Lyanna, he certainly wouldn't want her to be left alone, defenseless, in a relatively isolated tower, particularly if she were carrying another of his children. And it's the fact that Lyanna was carrying Rhaegar's child, and that he was apparently so infatuated with her, which leads me to believe that Rhaegar just might have had some foresight or mystical vision or understanding regarding the potential future importance of Jon Snow as the prince that was promised. That is, what if, just like many of his Targaryen predecessors, Rhaegar himself had received visions and prophecies foretelling the birth of a very important child by him and Lyanna Stark? Rhaegar once famously said of his oldest son, Aegon, that, quote, "He is the prince that was promised, and he is the song of ice and fire." But what if Rhaegar had the wrong son in mind, and he came to realize that it was his second son in Jon Snow who was the true subject of his prophetic visions? Now, this is certainly a point that merits analyzing in greater depth, and it might in part help explain Rhaegar's infatuation with Lyanna, but that too would have to be discussed in a later video, focused on Rhaegar. Most of the other criticisms are largely concentrated on potential timeline issues, like age discrepancies between Jon, Robb, and Daenerys, the time it would take to get to reach the Tower of Joy, etc. These issues, however, are difficult to accurately assess with the information we currently possess, and George R. R. Martin himself has admitted on a number of occasions to making some minor continuity issues or logic-based issues with certain aspects of A Song of Ice and Fire, so it's a little difficult to use the aforementioned arguments as points of evidence on their own, though in the same breath, timeline issues are certainly not an aspect one should necessarily dismiss altogether. There are some other criticisms against R+L=J, but they might typically fall into a topic for a later or different video, not directly related to the Tower of Joy, and they oftentimes propose alternate birth options for Jon Snow. With that in mind, Lyanna Stark did say, quote, "Promise me, Ned," with her dying breath, and this certainly merits looking at other alternatives as to what promised she expected of him. YouTubers like Preston Jacobs, and even my own friends and co-Small Council members in James of Thrones and LaDonna Sargent, have posited the notion that Daenerys was the one born to Lyanna and Rhaegar, although with the latter two, she was supposedly born as a sibling to Jon Snow. Notions emphasizing Daenerys being born at the Tower of Joy rather than at Dragonstone are primarily centered on the fact that, in her youth, when she was supposedly living in Braavos, she remembers living in a great house with a red door and a lemon tree outside of it, which might lead one to envision a Dornish climate rather than the largely barren landscape of Braavos, and since the young Viserys, who was 8 when Dany was born, was the only person to tell her of where she grew up, he must have either had a faulty memory due to his young age or was lying altogether. Another cited point is that while Ned refers to the or a promise he made to Lyanna Stark, there are apparently also other instances in which Ned reminisces on promises and secrets in plural, implying a promise made with respect to more than one individual. Another point raised is Ned's own displeasure at the idea of killing Dany when Robert Baratheon raises the issue in Book 1, having a more personal basis than merely a dislike of killing children. I could go on with these alternate theories and explore them outside the confines of the Tower of Joy, but again, they don't quite fit into the focus for this video, and I believe they are best explained by those who came up with these theories, and my own analysis of them won't do them any justice, so be sure to check out their theories, which I have linked in the info box below. Rather, there are other aspects of the Tower of Joy that have yet to be discussed, and mysteries that remain. So now, let me speak my own personal thoughts on the Tower of Joy. To be frank, I'm left with more questions than answers. Why did Eddard Stark tear down the tower? What happened that was so absolutely traumatic that it haunted Ned for the remainder of his days, and even caused him to lose sense of time and place itself right when Lyanna died? Did he witness some sort of supernatural event? Whatever happened at the tower and whatever Lyanna asked of Ned must have been quite traumatic, even for someone like him who has already fought countless battles by this point and witnessed numerous deaths. I would personally love it if the Tower of Joy hides a mystery greater than R+L=J, as it is the shocking and seemingly unexpected occurrences from A Song of Ice and Fire that has kept me hooked on the series, and as such, the idea of Ned and Ashara Dayne as Jon Snow's parents does appeal to me the most. However, based on all the hints Benioff and Weiss have been dropping in the show, it's looking more and more likely to me that the R+L=J route is the true nature of the Tower of Joy and Jon Snow's legacy. As they say, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Nevertheless, I will say this much. In the very first chapter with Eddard Stark's POV, he thinks the following statement, quote, "They had found him still holding her body, silent with grief. The little Crannog man, Howland Reed, had taken her hand from his. Ned could recall none of it." So put on your tinfoil hats and listen to one hypothesis I would like to propose. Given Ned's delirium, this might very well indicate the realization of a very different aspect of the Azor Ahai reborn prophecy. According to the myth, Azor Ahai plunges his untempered sword into the heart of his living wife, Nissa Nissa, her soul combined with the steel of the sword, creating Lightbringer, the sword of heroes used to fight the darkness that struck the land. Given that Rhaegar was already referred to and recognized as the prince that was promised on multiple occasions, and given that Lyanna might have apparently birthed Jon Snow in a pool of blood, I believe Rhaegar in this case is the Azor Ahai figure, and Lyanna is Nissa Nissa. Jon is himself the Lightbringer. He is the metaphorical sword that will halt the coming of the looming second long night, and end the threat of the White Walkers. In many different mythologies, including that of the Norse variety, the sword and the phallus are metaphorically depicted as one and can be understood as a metaphorical unification of life and death through an erotic meeting. So, Rhaegar's very act of inseminating Lyanna could very well be the literal parallel to Azor Ahai driving his sword into the heart of Nissa Nissa, and Jon emerging from her as the blade that killed her. While the original prophecy speaks of Azor Ahai wielding Lightbringer, I like to think that prophecies shouldn't always be literally trusted word for word, but can rather act as a metaphor for something else, as demonstrated in the tinfoil theory I just posited. Of course, that is just one aspect of Ned's thought in his first chapter. Remember that Ned recalls, quote, "They had found him still holding her body, silent with grief." While we originally are led to believe that only Ned and Howland Reed are present, it sounds like at least one other individual arrived to at least witness Ned's sadness. So here's what I propose. It is already implied that Ashara Dane was at Starfall, and that this is the location Ned travels to next in order to return the ancestral sword of House Dane to its rightful family, given the passing of Arthur Dane. Moreover, those who remained at the tower would have had to obtain provisions and some form of support from somewhere nearby, and given Arthur's friendship with Rhaegar and Starfall's relative proximity to the Tower of Joy, it makes the most sense that this house was at the very least assisting those present at the tower in the way of supplies and food. The only person I could imagine who might have had a reason to travel to the Tower of Joy is Wylla, the reported wet nurse of Jon Snow and the same woman Eddard claims to be Jon's true mother when he speaks with Robert Baratheon in Game of Thrones. My hunch is that Wylla, who worked for the Danes, was at the very least summoned by Sir Arthur to act as a wet nurse for the child Lyanna was expecting, and potentially aid with the childbirthing. She could have also played a role in facilitating provisions or supplies being brought to the tower in some way, and though she arrived a little too late, she could have been the additional person to arrive, with or without a retinue from House Dane, and witnessed Eddard's state of grief, as well as the newborn child. Whilst Wylla might normally have been tempted to flee, she could very well have noted that Eddard had not harmed the newly born child. Given the death of Arthur Dane and little other choice, Wylla could very well have insisted or encouraged Ned to come with her to Starfall in order to return the ancestral sword Dawn to its seat, and certainly she would have helped guide Ned and Howland Reed to the Danes' household. This certainly could indicate that there are some members of House Dane out there who might have also known of the truth behind Jon Snow. Of course, if Wylla were carrying the newborn child through the relatively barren Dornish marches in open sight, this would have facilitated the idea that Wylla was the true mother of the young Jon Snow, especially if nobody but Rhaegar and the members of the Kingsguard knew Lyanna was pregnant. Even if Jon wasn't the one born at the Tower of Joy, Wylla is currently the only other known character who could have conceivably stopped by the tower in the first place before the group traveled to Starfall. Well, folks, I think this is a good point to end this Part 1 video on the Tower of Joy, but evidently there are quite a few aspects that still need to be discussed. What of Ashara Dane? What about the other evidence prior to the events of the Tower of Joy which could provide evidence for or against a separate theory than R+L=J? While I do think Ashara Dane must play at least some kind of significant role in the book series A Song of Ice and Fire, and as a result I will explore the significance of House Dane in my next video in this series, as well as discuss Daenerys' reported birth and upbringing in a little more depth in the next video of this series. If there is enough interest, I would equally be happy to do a prequel video discussing Rhaegar Targaryen, which could act as a tie-in between this series of videos and my Summerhall videos. As always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. More importantly though, what are your thoughts on the Tower of Joy? Do you agree with my opinion? Certainly I posited one pro R+L=J theory, but that doesn't mean I have entirely given up looking at or embracing other alternative theories. If some of you have seen my admittedly poorly made video on Jon Snow's parentage almost 2 years ago, the A+N=J theory, or alternately, the Ashara plus Brandon theory, is one I was quite interested in. Given that, I will certainly be digging into these alternative theories in a little more depth in my next video.